Welcome back to Dark Wilderness. When I got to one part of today's story, I thought I knew for sure where this was heading, but the outcome of it took me by complete surprise, and I knew that I had to share this one on the show. But before we get to today's story, if you've had an encounter or an experience with anything that you would like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. If you want to join us on Facebook, I put a link to our group in the description as well. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you decide you're going to go off out into the woods to go on a moose hunt and you're not going to tell anybody where you're going, make sure you hit that subscribe button so we know where you are so that you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Today's story comes from Andrew, and it takes place in late October of 2020 during a period of time that I'm pretty sure a lot of us just want to forget about. It was the first year of COVID, lockdowns were in full swing, you couldn't see your friends, and those lockdowns hit Andrew pretty hard. He was living in Winnipeg at the time, which is the capital of Manitoba, and he was a third-level construction electrician. The construction trade here in Manitoba at that period of time was pretty much at a standstill. There was not a lot of work. So Andrew soon found himself unemployed and having to live off of government assistance. To make matters even worse for Andrew, him and his longtime girlfriend had broke up about a month before, and he was left feeling pretty lonely. And he was starting to develop a really bad case of cabin fever. He really just needed some form of an escape just to forget about everything going on in his life. And on a whim, he decided that the perfect thing for him to do in this situation was to go off on a solo moose hunt up in North Eastern Manitoba. Now, Andrew was not an avid hunter. He had just started hunting the year before when his buddy convinced him to get his hunter safety and go for deer with him a couple of times. But he did grow up going camping and fishing with his granddad and his father. But when it came to being alone in the wilderness, he was really not experienced at all. And even though Andrew knew that this probably was not the best idea, he just wanted to escape everything. He spent a little bit of time trying to figure out where he could go for moose because up in Manitoba, moose hunting is generally just a draw. So what a draw is you have to enter your name into a draw in order to be drawn for a tag. Now, there are a few game hunting areas or GHAs where you do not need to enter the draw. You could just pick up a tag and you could go hunting. So Andrew was looking through the hunting guide and discovered that GHA 17A, which is just north of Nopaming Provincial Park, was open to moose hunting. So he picked up a tag and that's where he was going to go. So he loaded up his truck with all the hunting gear that he did have and he started making the drive northeast of Winnipeg up to an area called English Brook. Now, English Brook was a place where Andrew had grown up going fishing with his granddad and his father, but he had never been north of there before. So once he got up to English Brook, there was a road heading north. He turned onto this gravel road and he drove quite a few miles north to where this road branched off down this other gravel road heading to the east. He drove down that road for a couple of miles, pulled his truck over to the side of the road, grabbed his stuff, and then he just started blindly walking into the bush heading north. Now, this area of the province is incredibly thick bush. We call it ugly bush up here, and it's very rocky, hilly, and swampy. So it's very hard to walk in a straight line because you're constantly going up and over rocks. You got to go around swamps, cross rivers. But Andrew did not care about any of that. He just kept walking into the bush, focusing, just listening and watching for any sign of a moose. After a few miles, he came to this large rock. He got up to the top of it, and he could see this big marshy swamp in front of him. So he stood there for a few minutes, just listening and watching, and then he heard the sound of a bull moose call coming from the other side of this swamp. So Andrew thought, perfect, I'm finally on a moose. So he started heading towards where he heard that call. After walking for a few minutes, he arrived at the area where he was pretty certain that call came from, but there was no sign of the moose. So he started looking around down on the ground for any tracks, and sure enough, he found a fresh set leading away from the swamp and into the bush. So he got his shotgun ready, and he started following the tracks. As he was making his way through the bush, he was really focused, looking down and looking up ahead, just to make sure that he was still on this moose's trail. After a while, about an hour and a half, he started to realize that the weather was really starting to turn ugly. It was sleet and freezing rain. He was completely soaked. He was absolutely freezing at this point, and he was about to give up. But then he looked up ahead of him and he saw that bull moose. He could see his horn sticking out from behind a pine tree. So he started to get very excited. However, he did realize that this moose was just out of range and he was going to have to try to sneak up a little bit closer if he wanted to get a shot. Somehow, whether he stepped on something and made some noise or this moose smelt him, this moose got alerted to him in the bush and ended up taking off. At this point, Andrew was feeling completely defeated because now he's completely soaked. There's one chance at a moose is completely blown now. And then Andrew realized that he had absolutely no idea where he was, because as he was following those tracks, he was really focused looking down and looking ahead. And when he started looking around, he realized that nothing at all looked familiar to him. He had no idea where he was. And this was also an area that he had never gone before. So he really had no idea at all exactly how to get back to his truck. This would not be a good situation for even an experienced outdoorsman to be in, but Andrew was not an experienced outdoorsman. He was completely unprepared for this hunt. He was completely unprepared for the situation he just found himself in. He had no compass. He was not dressed appropriately. He had no survival gear on him. And he did have a cell phone, but he left that in his truck because he figured it would be useless anyway because there was no cell service. So he really had no way at all to tell even what direction was what. At this point, the panic was starting to set in and his heart was just completely racing because he knew he was completely lost. He took a few breaths, trying to kind of calm himself down, think of his next course of action, and then he thought he would just follow those moose tracks all the way back to the swamp. The only problem with that was because of the way the weather was with the sleet, the freezing rain, a lot of those tracks were completely not visible to Andrew. So he just picked the direction that he thought those tracks had came from, the way that he came in, and he just started walking into the bush. He walked for about an hour before it was completely full on dark. He stopped, he put a headlamp on, and then he continued making his way through this absolutely dense bush, going over these rocks with just a headlamp. At one point, he came to a little creek, and he stopped for a second, and he was looking at this creek, and he realized that he had already crossed this creek. He had gone in a big, giant circle. At this point, Andrew's feeling completely more devastated and completely hopeless, because now he knows he's just wandering blindly, even more so than he was already aware of. So he started looking around and he noticed off to his right one of those big rock hills. So he decided he was going to go climb up to the top to see if he could see a sign of anything at all, if he could spot a sign of a road or maybe a ranger tower, anything at all. He was so desperate at this point. So he made his way over to this rock, and now he had to climb 20 feet up to the top. When he was about halfway up, he put his foot down on this little rock piece that stuck out from the side, but because of that freezing rain and that sleet, as soon as he put weight down on his foot just shot out from under him, and he ended up falling 10 feet to the ground below. When he hit the ground, he felt an excruciating pain shooting up his leg from his left ankle, and he knew that now he was in even more trouble than he was in before. He lied there for a minute just in absolute agony. He did not know if his ankle was broken or if it was just sprained, but he did have enough sense to not take his boot off. He knew if he took his boot off, if his ankle was broken or sprained and started to swell up, he would never get that boot back on and he would not be able to walk out. As he's laying there in complete pain and agony, he started looking around for anything that he could use to make a makeshift splint for his leg. And he noticed that there was a big branch just a couple of feet away, so he crawled over, broke it in half, then he reached into his backpack, took out a couple of game bags, and he used those to tie these branches to his leg to stabilize his ankle. At this point, he had shock setting in on top of being completely soaked and freezing already, and he knew that he had to get warm, and making a fire in these conditions was pretty much going to be impossible because everything was just completely soaked. So he reached back into his backpack, and he had one more game bag left. So he ripped a hole at the top, one on each side, then he put it on like a makeshift poncho. At this point, he curled up in the fetal position and was just trying to stay warm. At one point, he dozed off, he fell asleep, and then he felt something shake him, and he heard the words, "Skippy, we gotta go, let's move." And he woke up, and he wasn't sure when he first woke up if he had just dreamed this or if he had actually heard this. And he kind of lied there for a minute, kind of trying to process just what had happened, because this voice that he heard sounded exactly like his grandfather. Now, his grandfather had passed away 3 years before this, so Andrew at this point was starting to think that he was just going delirious from the cold. Maybe this is some type of symptom of hypothermia, and he was just really trying to collect himself at this point, when all of a sudden he heard that same voice coming from about 20 yards ahead of him on the side of that big rock face. So Andrew kind of sat up, and now he's looking towards where he heard this voice from, and he's thinking, this voice sounds exactly like my grandfather, and it called me Skippy. Skippy was his childhood nickname that his grandfather always called him, and nobody else aside from his grandfather and his family members knew that that was his nickname. So Andrew just kind of sat there looking that way, again, just trying to process what he's hearing, and he hears this voice again. At this point, Andrew did not have a feeling of dread. He did not have any type of fear at all. This voice was actually very comforting to him at this point, and he felt inside that he should really listen to this voice and he should go to it. So very carefully, he started to get up. He used his shotgun to kind of help prop himself up, and then he limped towards where he heard that voice, using his shotgun as a crutch. When he got there, he actually called out Grandpa, kind of hoping that he would get some form of a response, but the only response that he got back was, "This way, Skippy." And again, when he heard that voice and he heard "This way, Skippy," he felt no feeling of fear at all. He did not feel like there was any danger ahead. He did not feel like he was being lured into the bush. That voice actually gave him an intense feeling of comfort. So again, he just felt like he needed to follow this voice. Like, he felt like this was his grandfather, and his grandfather was going to help lead him to safety. For several hours, he made his way through the bush, going around swamps, over creeks, through real thick bush, always hearing "This way, Skippy," about 20 yards, 50 yards ahead of him. At one point, he heard the voice say, "Over here, Skippy," which was completely different than everything else he had heard over the last few hours. And when he got to that spot where he heard the voice that last time, he looked in front of him, and he noticed that there was a road, and his truck was sitting right up alongside that road. At this point, Andrew just completely broke down in tears and just kept thanking his grandfather over and over. Andrew truly believes that his grandfather was with him there in the bush when he was feeling the most helpless and hopeless he has ever felt in his life, and that his grandfather helped bring him to safety, and if it wasn't for that, that he most likely would have died in those woods up in North Eastern Manitoba. Well, that's it for today's story. As always, thanks for joining us, and if you have any comments, please leave it in the comments below. I'd really love to know your thoughts on this, and if you haven't done so already, next time you go off on a solo hunt and you decide not to tell anybody where you're going, make sure you hit that subscribe button so we know where you are, and I'll see you next time.